Hi everyone, and welcome back to Chess for Charity, where half of all income goes directly to charity. In this video, I'm going to go over a game between Elisabeth Pähtz and Bibisara Assaubayeva. Up until this point, Elisabeth Pähtz had 2 of her 3 grandmaster norms, which means that if she secured a victory in this round, she would be crowned a grandmaster. Excellent, let's get started. So the game opens up d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, c4, bishop g7, kind of a normal opening, non-combative in the center. After a couple more developing moves, after an exchange of pawns, we get to a pretty normal position in the Grunfeld. Okay, so let's see here. After knight c6, once we kind of get out of the opening, we see that there's pressure right now against d4, so e3 is played to prevent that. Rook to e8. Pawn h3, so we want to prevent this pin because we don't want that bishop getting here. That's a sensitive square. And then pawn a4. Okay, so maybe grabbing some space on this side of the board. Maybe one day trying to control this square against any knight hops or pawn moves or bishop moves. So just at this moment, mostly planning moves. Okay, attacking this knight on c6. You can't capture because there are 2 defenders and 2 attackers. So instead, the knight has to move. Now we're putting additional pressure on d5, which means that the pawn on e3 can now push to e4. Really great pawn presence in the center by white here. Okay. c6, trying to break up this pawn chain, and white says, okay, fine, I have to break it up. I can't do anything else after kicking the knight. And then they trade, and let's see what we got. So rook d1, so now eyeing up this open d file after the pawn captures on c6, bishop to f1, putting some pressure on this knight, maybe preventing a couple of moves where the bishop can move and the rook can move. Just an idea. Knight to c5, trying to get your piece back in the center of the board. The knight comes out and attacks this, the bishop comes out. I gotta know my pieces. The bishop comes out and attacks this knight. Knight has to hop forward to defend. And after a trade of knights on the rim, this knight's a little bit trapped. So right now, this is a threat. Both are coordinating here. Rook to c1, saying if you take my pawn, I will take your pawn. Okay. Well, black didn't capture the pawn, instead played bishop a6. And in the eyes of the computer, this is a mistake. Let's try to see why. So it seems like after you exchange, you can block the center up and say, I don't want this bishop to get out at all. This bishop is now seeing nothing. It's biting on a rock. Okay, so one goal should be to get that bishop out soon. After rook to c8, there's actually a vulnerability in this move, which is that the knight can get kicked back, and then the pawn can continue to march forward, like this. b5, saying, you can't take me, you're in a pin, which means you have to figure something else out. The rook has to move. Rook goes back to a8, and white picks up a pawn. Great. So up until this point, white is winning a pawn. This knight is on the edge, kind of blocked off. It has this square at the moment, but that, if you go there now, I think that just invites tempo there. So, okay, keep that in mind. Pawn to f6, trying to challenge this key pawn in the center. This pawn is preventing this bishop from seeing anything. Okay, great. So how do you prevent that? How do you fight against that if you're white? Well, you just ignore it, and you say rook on the 7th is going to hurt. So the rook goes to the 7th rank, and from there the king comes up because it has to defend this key e7 pawn. And now you could take or you could push, and in this case white decides to take, and the pawn can't capture because it's pinned. So now you've separated this pawn, you have a loose pawn here, a couple pawns on this side of the board, and then after knight g5 check, the king goes back. And here's a cool sequence, which is you might see the tactic that if rook takes, If the rook recaptures, you win this rook on d7. So white has to be careful before their next move and make sure that if they see that, they have a response to it. And this is exactly why we're going to have a grandmaster on our hands, because she did see the move. Instead, she took, and now, with this whole sequence I just showed in mind, after rook takes pawn, rook takes rook was not played. Sorry, I was jumping ahead. Instead of rook takes rook and losing this, there's a desperado in-between move, which is rook takes pawn, check. That way, you drag the king away, you get that pawn, so now you have 2 pawns up. And then you take that rook, and this pawn is pretty weak. Okay, is there any hope for black here? No, it doesn't appear so. Pawn, or the king goes up to f7, the knight checks, and at this point, black resigned. So that was a really quick overview of the game, but with that resignation, white got her 3rd grandmaster norm, and she is now a grandmaster. In fact, she is the first women's German grandmaster. So great big shout out to Elisabeth Pähtz. That's amazing. And that rating of 2475 might just keep going up. So that's all for this video. If you liked my content, please be sure to subscribe, like it on YouTube, all those great things. I'll be making more content regarding chess, maybe puzzles, all of those wonderful things. So please stay tuned. And all of my efforts are geared toward spreading the love of chess and helping charity. So if you want to do either of those 2 things, be sure to support. Thanks so much. Bye.